Marcus Bennett, a black Marine Corps veteran, pulled into the circular driveway of his estate. The home, a sprawling mansion with clean white columns and a marble entrance, should have felt like a welcome embrace after months deployed overseas. But instead of calm, confusion surged through him. Red and blue lights pulsed against the polished stone, bouncing off the sleek curves of his black SUV. Police cruisers lined the front entrance. Engines hummed quietly. Two officers stood near the door, their conversation low and unreadable. Marcus stepped out with the kind of quiet poise that only years of military service could teach, though his chest tightened with unease. A tall officer approached, clipboard in hand, face serious but not aggressive. "Sir, we need to verify your identity before we can let you inside," he said, his voice steady, almost procedural. Marcus nodded, pulling out his military credentials and driver's license without hesitation. "I'm Marcus Bennett," he said. "This is my home." The officer glanced over the documents, then radioed in for confirmation. "We got a report from your neighbor, Laura Whitman," he explained. "She claimed a suspicious person was trying to break into this house." Marcus's brow furrowed. He looked toward the entrance, unsettled. "That doesn't make sense. I own this house. I've just returned from active duty. Who exactly is Laura Whitman?" The officer gestured subtly to a woman standing off to the side. Mid-50s, white, and visibly stern, she watched Marcus closely, arms crossed over her HOA badge blouse like a self-appointed guardian. Before he could ask another question, she stepped forward. "I've been living here for the past 3 weeks," she said, her tone unshakably firm. "The house was abandoned, and I took it upon myself to stay here. Keep an eye on things, protect the neighborhood." Marcus blinked, incredulous. "You've been living in my house without permission?" "I had approval from the homeowners association," Laura replied, chin lifted with defiance. "I was just trying to ensure safety in the area." The officers looked between the two, visibly unsure. On one side, the rightful homeowner. On the other, a neighbor acting like the property had somehow become her jurisdiction. One officer motioned for Marcus to step aside so they could continue questioning Laura. Marcus's mind spun. This house had always been his peace, his reset after deployment. And now, that peace was shattered. Not by criminals, not by looters, but by someone who claimed to be a protector while occupying what wasn't hers. The betrayal burned deeper, knowing it came from a neighbor he barely knew. The front door creaked open. Laura walked inside, guiding the officers like a hostess, then turned back toward Marcus. He followed reluctantly, stepping into what suddenly felt like a stranger's home. The air carried the scent of something warm, like someone had recently cooked a meal. That wasn't right. The living room showed subtle but jarring changes. A pair of reading glasses rested on the coffee table beside an open book and half-full glass of wine. Marcus's gaze swept the room. "This is my home," he said quietly, each word heavy. "How long have you been staying here?" 3 weeks, Laura answered, like it was a point of pride. "I made sure everything stayed in order. The neighborhood needed someone here." Marcus walked deeper into the house, noting more changes. His family photos swapped out for framed neighborhood watch snapshots. His mail stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, fresh flowers on the dining table. "This is trespassing," he said flatly, turning to face her. "You never asked. And the HOA has no say over my private property." Laura's eyes narrowed. "The HOA exists to protect this community. With rising crime, we couldn't risk leaving a house like this empty. I did what I thought was right." Marcus's frustration surged. "What you did wasn't protection, it was possession. You took control of something that didn't belong to you." The officers quietly took notes as tension thickened in the air. Outside, neighbors had started to gather. The flashing lights had drawn them in. Whispers passed between them as they watched the confrontation from a distance. Sensing the crowd, Laura raised her voice. "I was just trying to keep our neighborhood safe. We can't afford to be passive." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Safety doesn't give you permission to violate someone else's rights. You don't get to decide who belongs in my home." The officer stepped in. "Ma'am, "We're going to need you to leave the premises," one of them said firmly. "This property belongs to Mr. Bennett." Laura's eyes flicked with resistance, but she said nothing. Wordlessly, she began collecting her things, a tote bag, a few personal items, and walked through the house as if it still belonged to her. Marcus stood in the doorway, the weight of everything sinking in. His sanctuary had been violated, not by strangers, but by someone who thought she knew better. The damage wasn't physical, it was personal. As the gates closed behind Laura, flanked by police cruisers and flashing lights fading into dusk, Marcus finally locked his front door. The click echoed through the foyer like a line being drawn in the sand, one that felt both comforting and paper-thin. He paused for a moment, taking a slow, steadying breath. The shock still lingered, but something deeper had started to settle in, resolve. He turned and stepped fully inside, the officers remaining near the entry like quiet sentinels. Their presence reminded him that what had just happened wasn't some misunderstanding, it was a breach. Laura Whitman was gone, but her presence clung to the house like smoke after a fire. Nothing looked broken, but everything felt touched. Room by room, Marcus moved through his home like a stranger inspecting someone else's life. In his study, he froze. His desk, usually cluttered in his own system of chaos, had been reorganized into stiff, precise stacks. A whiteboard hung on the wall, covered in handwritten notes about security patrols and neighborhood watch meetings, none of which he'd ever scheduled. His calendar had been replaced with one marked in unfamiliar handwriting. Block letters highlighted dates for community events he'd never attended. And there, resting on his office chair, was his laptop, screen locked but clearly used. The kitchen offered more of the same. Dishes drying in a rack. A half-used bottle of olive oil still uncapped. And then a note stuck to the counter in bold marker. "Neighbors feel safer knowing someone is home." Marcus stared at it, then crumpled the paper in his fist. His frustration rose like heat in his chest. One of the officers approached, voice low and professional. "Mr. Bennett, would you like us to photograph everything? If you plan on pressing charges, this could all serve as evidence." "Yes," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Document everything. This goes far beyond trespassing. She violated my privacy, invaded my home." The officer nodded and pulled out his camera, beginning a methodical sweep through the rooms. Flash after flash illuminated Laura's trail, an uninvited presence recorded now in legal clarity. Marcus stood silently, watching the process unfold with a strange mix of helplessness and fury. This house had always been his sanctuary, the one place untouched by the chaos of deployment. But now it felt violated. Laura had said she was protecting the neighborhood, but Marcus knew better. She had taken what wasn't hers and justified it with flimsy authority. "The HOA doesn't have the right to approve that kind of thing," he muttered to the officer, who nodded in agreement. Determined to get answers, Marcus asked the officers to accompany him to the local HOA office. If Laura had truly acted with their blessing, he wanted it confirmed, or denied, officially. At the HOA headquarters, he was met with a mix of polite smiles and diplomatic deflections. No, the board had not authorized Laura, or anyone, to occupy a private residence without the owner's consent. Her actions were not sanctioned. They were described as unilateral, well-intentioned, and not reflective of official policy. Yet, there was no formal reprimand. No sign anyone had tried to stop her either. The lines of authority were blurrier than Marcus expected. Laura had acted under her own power, cloaking it in neighborhood concern, and no one had stood in her way. When he returned home later that evening, she was back, briefly, to collect a few forgotten belongings. Marcus didn't let the moment pass. "You had no right," he said, his tone firm but controlled. "The HOA didn't approve it. This was all you." Laura didn't flinch. "I did what had to be done. The house was empty. The neighborhood needed someone watching it." "Concern doesn't excuse breaking the law," Marcus replied. "You stepped into my life, my space, without permission." Officers nearby took notice and stepped in, calmly reminding Laura that she was no longer allowed on the property. She packed quietly, but her posture said she felt justified to the end. The standoff didn't stay quiet for long. News spread fast. Neighbors whispered, argued, and took sides. Some praised Laura's initiative, calling her a protector. Others were outraged on Marcus's behalf, recognizing the deep violation of boundaries. Even those who had admired Laura's involvement in HOA affairs now began questioning her judgment and her motivations. Marcus found himself unexpectedly at the center of a larger debate. It wasn't just about his house anymore. It was about how far someone could go in the name of community safety, and what it meant when that pursuit ignored the basic rights of an individual. Despite the stress, Marcus kept his focus. He reached out to trusted friends, legal experts, and fellow veterans for guidance. He knew this wasn't just about pushing back, it was about setting precedent. The deeper he reflected, the clearer it became. Laura's actions revealed a troubling pattern. Control disguised as care, power exercised without permission, and beneath it all, a dangerous assumption that her version of protection overrode his right to privacy. As the officers wrapped up their evidence gathering and prepared their reports, Marcus stood alone in the center of his living room. The light was dim, and the house was quiet again, but not the same. He looked around at the place that had once been his peace and felt the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a question of who gets to decide the rules, and who those rules truly serve. And Marcus wasn't about to let the answer go unchallenged. As night settled over the quiet neighborhood, Marcus stood at the center of his home, his mind drifting back to memories shaped in places far from here. In the military, structure was everything. Respect was earned and boundaries were upheld with precision. But here, in the calm suburb that was supposed to be his peace, those same values felt tested, blurred, almost breakable. Still, Marcus knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this stand. Not silently. This was his home, and with it came the right to decide who belonged inside its walls. That right wasn't theoretical. It was lived, earned, defended. By morning, word had spread, not just through official reports or online threads, but porch whispers, mailbox glances, and the kind of half-conversations that carried more weight than they should. Neighbors gathered near Marcus's house in small clusters. Some stood in silence. Others murmured with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and quiet judgment. To some, Laura Whitman was a hero. She was just doing what needed to be done, one woman said, her voice rising over a group near the corner mailbox. With crime rising, we need people who aren't afraid to act. But others saw things differently. Intentions don't change the facts, an older man replied, arms folded. You can't just move into someone's house because you feel it's the right thing to do. That's not protection, that's trespassing. The air grew dense with debate. What started as a single act had peeled back layers of tension long hidden beneath the neighborhood's polished surface. For some, it was about safety. For others, it was about principle. But for Marcus, it was always about dignity and the rule of law. That evening, the local community center overflowed. The HOA had called an emergency meeting. Residents packed in shoulder to shoulder, the murmur of voices thick with anticipation. Marcus arrived early. His presence shifted the energy in the room. Some greeted him with quiet nods of support. Others avoided his gaze entirely. The HOA president, a man used to measured words and middle ground solutions, stepped forward. We understand that recent events have created confusion and concern, he began. Our job is to preserve both the safety and the harmony of this community. But we must also remember to uphold the rights of every homeowner. When Marcus took the microphone, the room fell into a hush. His voice was steady, but carried weight. What happened to me wasn't community protection, he said. It was a violation. Laura Whitman acted without my consent, without the board's consent, and what's more, without any legal authority. This isn't just about property. It's about respect. Respect for boundaries, for privacy, for law. A few heads nodded in quiet agreement, but not all. Laura stood, her posture unshaken. "I acted because no one else would," she said, voice resolute. "The neighborhood was vulnerable. If that makes me a vigilante, so be it." The room erupted into debate. Voices clashed. Some applauded her courage, praising her for stepping in where they believed institutions had failed. "We can't always wait for permission to protect ourselves," one resident argued. But others pushed back. "If we start excusing illegal actions just because they come wrapped in good intentions," another neighbor said, "we're rewriting the rules that hold this place together." The conversation revealed a deep split between those leaning toward collective fear and those standing firm on personal rights. And in the middle stood Marcus, caught in the crossfire of opinions, his service and identity quietly shaping how people responded to his truth. Outside, the discussions continued under porch lights and over fences. Some neighbors, once firmly in Laura's camp, began to reconsider, questioning her motivations. Was this really about safety or about control? Had she crossed a line simply because she thought she could? Rumors began to surface, stories of past HOA disputes, of Laura overstepping before, stories that now painted her actions in a more troubling light. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself navigating a storm of quiet politics. Supporters reached out privately, thanking him for his courage. But publicly, many remained cautious, afraid to take a side, unsure of the social cost. It wasn't just about one woman moving into someone's house anymore. It had become a mirror, a reflection of deeper tensions, race, power, privilege, and who gets to decide what safety really looks like. As a black man, a veteran, and a homeowner, Marcus understood all too well the layers people didn't speak aloud. The way some had rushed to defend Laura, not just because of what she did, but because of who she wasn't, and who he was. Still, he didn't let the bitterness in. Instead, he kept showing up, meeting with neighbors willing to listen, sharing his story, drawing the line between vigilance and violation. "This isn't about blame," he told one small gathering. "It's about boundaries. If we don't respect the rules, we can't protect each other." Meanwhile, Laura began organizing meetings of her own, gathering neighbors who felt the world was changing too fast, too unpredictably. She talked about taking back control, about not relying on institutions. And some listened. Fear has a way of dressing up as common sense when left unchecked. The neighborhood was no longer what it had been a week before. Greetings were shorter. Eye contact, rarer. Conversations were cautious. What had once felt like a united community now felt uncertain, split by fault lines that were always there, just waiting for a tremor. Despite the growing wave of criticism, Laura Whitman held her ground. Her posture didn't falter, not even as more residents began to question her choices. But the pressure was mounting, and it was clear the situation had outgrown anyone's ability to control it alone. As tensions continued to climb, some neighbors began calling for a neutral third party, someone who could help the community navigate the increasingly bitter divide. The HOA board, though well-meaning, admitted their limitations. The incident had peeled back deeper, long unspoken issues, ones far beyond their capacity to resolve with a few meetings or policy updates. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus Bennett found himself reflecting more deeply than ever on what home truly meant. To him, it wasn't just a roof or property lines. It was a symbol of peace, of service, of identity earned through sacrifice. The trespass had shaken more than his sense of safety. It had fractured something sacred. But it had also made one thing clear. This wasn't a moment to step back. It was time to stand taller. The neighborhood watched as the story evolved, its meaning shifting with every retelling. Some saw it as a tale of heroism. Others, a cautionary breach of rights. Everyone brought their own lens, shaped by their experiences, fears, and hopes. And in the rare moments when the noise died down, Marcus found strength in the quiet. Friends and family checked in. They reminded him who he was, a man of integrity, discipline, and grace under pressure. They reminded him that standing up didn't have to be loud to be powerful. The neighborhood, meanwhile, remained split. The issue had outgrown its original conflict. It had become a deeper question about how communities define safety, who gets to decide the rules, and what happens when those definitions collide. Marcus sat alone in his living room one evening, surrounded by familiar walls that now held unfamiliar memories. The long shadows from sunset stretched across the space, casting silhouettes that reminded him just how personal this all had become. Filing the lawsuit hadn't been an easy choice. He had hoped it wouldn't come to that. But Laura had crossed a line. Accountability was the only path forward. The legal complaint was submitted swiftly, charging Laura with criminal trespass and unlawful occupation of private property. Marcus's attorney made the stakes clear. This wasn't just a dispute over real estate. It was about dignity, consent, and the laws that protect both. News of the lawsuit spread quickly, reaching far beyond their suburb. The story caught attention for what it represented: the increasingly blurry line between individual rights and community control. But Laura didn't back down. She pushed harder, launching her own public campaign to reframe the narrative. In her version, she wasn't a trespasser. She was a protector. Flyers began appearing on doorsteps, social media posts circulated, and group emails painted her as the person brave enough to act when no one else would. At HOA meetings, her supporters rallied around her. They argued for expanding the association's authority during emergency situations. "We need to empower people who are willing to protect us," Laura said at one such gathering, her voice calm but commanding. Marcus was often present at these meetings too, met with cold stares and occasional open hostility. Some neighbors accused him of being rigid, out of touch with what the community needed. And while few said it aloud, he could feel the undercurrent, the racial dynamic quietly threading through the reactions, coloring who was afforded grace and who was met with scrutiny. The HOA board, now overwhelmed, tried to mediate. They proposed clearer rules, guidelines for what to do if a homeowner was away, protocols to prevent future misunderstandings. But consensus proved elusive. Even the board itself seemed fractured, unsure how to move forward without alienating half the community. As the legal case progressed, depositions were taken, statements collected. Marcus's team built a detailed record, photographs showing how the house had been altered, eyewitness accounts from neighbors, and documentation proving Laura had acted entirely on her own. Laura's defense hinged on her intentions. "I didn't do this out of malice," she testified. "I did it because I was afraid for our neighborhood. If that makes me a villain, then maybe people need to reevaluate what safety really means." The courtroom wasn't just a venue for justice. It became a battleground of ideology. Where does personal freedom end and collective responsibility begin? The judge, careful and methodical, listened as both sides laid out their arguments. Everyone in that room understood. This wasn't just about Marcus Bennett's house anymore. The verdict could set a precedent for communities across the state, maybe beyond. Back in the neighborhood, the tension persisted. Conversations in coffee shops and grocery store aisles still turned to the case. Some expressed sadness that it had escalated to this point. Others felt Marcus had done exactly what was necessary. And Marcus? He kept going. Not because he wanted a spotlight, but because silence would have meant surrendering something deeper than square footage. He knew this wasn't just about legal precedent. It was about trust, about race, about the invisible power dynamics that determine whose voice carries weight in times of conflict. Behind closed doors, the weight of it all pressed heavy. But Marcus stayed grounded. He knew that justice wasn't about popularity. It was about principle. As the hearings moved forward, Laura's defense began to show cracks. One by one, neighbors came forward. People who had their own stories of lines she had crossed, boundaries she'd ignored, always under the guise of doing what's best. Their testimonies echoed Marcus's own experience. What had been dismissed as a one-time lapse now looked like a pattern. As Laura Whitman's support began to wane, the HOA board, once hesitant to take sides, started publicly distancing themselves from her claims. They emphasized a clear message: community action must be rooted in consent and legality. Her actions, however well-intended they may have seemed to some, could not be justified by bypassing a homeowner's rights. Marcus Bennett's legal team seized the moment. With new statements from the HOA and neighbors coming forward, they tightened their argument. This case wasn't just about one home. It was about the integrity of property rights and the danger of allowing authority to go unchecked within neighborhood structures. The media attention, though often intrusive, brought wider awareness to what had unfolded. Stories circulated in legal blogs, civil rights forums, and local news outlets. Debates about homeowner protections, HOA overreach, and the role of racial bias in community disputes spilled beyond the borders of Marcus's street. Conversations ignited in places Marcus would never visit, but his story became part of a larger national dialogue. Through it all, Marcus remained composed, measured. He wasn't interested in vengeance. He wanted resolution. He wanted understanding. Most of all, he wanted to protect the values that had drawn him to this home in the first place: peace, dignity, and fairness. Each court hearing peeled back another layer. This wasn't just a neighborly spat. It was a window into the subtle but powerful tensions that exist in even the quietest of suburbs. Marcus knew the case's outcome would ripple far beyond his own driveway. It would shape how this community saw itself. In the still moments between legal meetings and HOA gatherings, Marcus reflected. He thought about assumptions, how quickly people leap to conclusions without asking questions, about boundaries, how fragile they become when not defended, and about dialogue, how desperately it was needed. He knew the road ahead was long, but he wasn't turning back. The final mediation was held in a plain conference room at the county courthouse. A neutral space. No flashing lights, no headlines, just two people sitting across from each other, facing the weight of everything that had happened. Marcus arrived with his attorney, calm and steady. Laura sat opposite him, her expression a mixture of fatigue and pride. She hadn't backed down, but something in her posture said she knew this was the end of the road. The mediator, seasoned and impartial, began the session by encouraging both parties to focus on resolution, on healing, not just winning. Marcus spoke first. When I came back from deployment, I expected to return to peace. What I found was that my home had been entered, my things moved, my privacy taken, not by a stranger, but by someone I was supposed to call a neighbor. He laid out the facts, the photos, the emotional toll, but he also acknowledged the larger fears that had driven Laura's actions. I understand concern for the neighborhood, but that concern must never override respect for ownership, for boundaries, for dignity. Laura's response was quieter than before. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said. Maybe I should have asked. Maybe I should have waited. But I truly believe the neighborhood was at risk. The mediator shifted the conversation toward solutions, real, structural ones. Together, they explored better communication methods, clarified limits of HOA power, and discussed safety measures that didn't require breaching personal property. Marcus pushed for transparency and consent to be formalized in the HOA's procedures. Laura, for the first time, agreed openly. She would step back from her self-appointed role and re-engage with the community through proper channels. Outside that room, the neighborhood watched with cautious hope. The HOA board, now more engaged than ever, took detailed notes and committed to revising outdated policies. For the first time, it felt like the community was moving toward actual accountability. As the session ended, Marcus stood and exhaled. The weight hadn't lifted entirely, but it had shifted. He had spoken his truth. He had defended his home and his principles with strength and grace. In the days that followed, things began to change. The HOA passed new guidelines centered on homeowner consent and clear authority limits. Neighborhood watch groups were restructured, with training requirements and accountability baked in. There would be no more lone guardians acting on instinct. Laura, no longer a figurehead, rejoined meetings as a regular resident. Her tone had changed. Less controlling, more cooperative. Some still admired her resolve. Others remained wary. But even she seemed to understand now. Leadership without trust is just control in disguise. Marcus, for his part, engaged with his community carefully. Not distant, but not naive. He listened, he spoke, and he made room for difficult conversations. The experience had reshaped his understanding of what community really meant. He'd learned that a home isn't just built with brick and stone. It's built with boundaries, respect, and mutual care. And those things, once threatened, are worth defending. What had begun as a violation became a mirror, forcing a community to look at itself and ask, who gets to feel safe here? Who gets to decide? Marcus's stand ensured that the answer would no longer be left to assumption. Because sometimes, the real fight for home begins after the battle is over. One evening, Marcus Bennett stood quietly on his porch, the fading light painting the street in soft gold. He watched his neighbors pass one another with easy smiles, their greetings unguarded, no longer strained by suspicion or tension. There was still healing to be done, but something had shifted. Beneath the weight of everything they'd endured, a more thoughtful, respectful community had begun to take root. The conflict had left scars, yes, but it had also created space for growth. It reminded them all that boundaries, while essential, don't have to become barriers. That with empathy, dialogue, and a shared commitment to doing better, safety and respect could live side by side. Marcus's story didn't end with a court ruling or a policy change. It lived on in quiet glances of understanding, in neighbors looking out for one another without overstepping, in a deeper recognition of what it means to truly belong. And in that way, his experience became more than a personal stand. It became a subtle, steady reminder that true vigilance is not about control. It's about care. And when anchored in respect, it has the power not just to protect homes, but to strengthen the heart of a community. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.